Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Today, we're going back to 1872,
Oh, wow.
cracking open this book called A Guide to Moral and Social Manners. Now, the title might sound a little stuffy.
Yeah, like etiquette lessons or something.
Exactly. But trust me, this author had much bigger ambitions. He basically wanted to create a roadmap for moral and civic conduct.
Interesting. Who was he writing this for?
He was especially focused on young citizens in a republic.
So thinking about the future of the nation.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that he saw this book as filling a gap in public education, like something crucial that schools weren't teaching,
So it's like a glimpse into how Americans back then thought about personal responsibility.
and how they believed it connected to building a strong, thriving society. So yeah, we're not just going to be talking about which fork to use at a fancy dinner party.
Right, more like the foundations of a well-functioning republic.
Exactly. Our mission today is to unearth the book's core arguments. How did this author connect personal virtue to good governance?
And are those ideas totally outdated, or do they still speak to us today?
So let's dive in. The book starts by focusing on what it calls the inward senses.
Inward senses, what are those?
Yeah, it's not the most intuitive term, but it basically refers to things like conscience, justice, benevolence.
Okay, so those kind of core moral principles.
Right. Now, did he think people were just born with these virtues, or could you develop them?
Good question. And that's actually where it gets really interesting. He argued that these inward senses, they aren't just lofty ideals floating around, they're innate human faculties.
Like built into us.
Yeah, he even compared them to muscles. Like you have to exercise them to make them strong.
So it's less about being a born saint and more about, like, hitting the ethical gym.
Haha, exactly. Moral workouts. And he even lays out these specific rules for cultivating each virtue.
Okay, so give me an example. What's one of these rules?
Well, under justice, for instance, he says, respect the interests of others as much as your own.
That's a good one. Pretty timeless, right? I feel like that could solve a lot of problems.
Right. And then under benevolence, it's love thy neighbor as thyself. That one's been around for centuries.
Classic wisdom.
And there's also compassion. Be always ready to assist in time of calamity or danger. Makes you think about how we react in a crisis.
Individually and as a society.
Exactly. Oh, and I like the one for veracity. That's about honesty and truth.
What's the rule for that one?
Be ever vigilant to ascertain facts. So not just blindly believing things, but actively seeking out the truth.
Yeah, like fact-checking before it was cool. These rules seem to cover a lot of ground. Personal integrity, how we treat others, even civic responsibility. But the big question is, why did the author think this personal stuff was so crucial for a whole government to succeed?
Especially a republic.
Yeah, especially a republic.
Well, he makes this really interesting argument that in a self-governing nation, you can't just rely on laws and punishments to make things run smoothly.
People have to internalize a sense of duty.
Exactly, like making moral choices even when no one's watching.
It's like that saying, the government you get is the government you deserve.
Right. It all starts with individual choices. And he really believed this was more important in a republic than in other forms of government.
Why is that?
Because in a republic, he says the citizens are the government, their individual choices directly shape the nation's character.
So if the people are dishonest or selfish or apathetic,
Then the republic itself becomes weak and vulnerable.
that's a lot of pressure on each person.
Right. It's not just about following the leader, it's about each citizen being a leader in their own way.
I like that. So, okay, how does this all play out in everyday life?
Like, what specific things did he think people should do?
Yeah, what were the civic duties he saw as essential?
He gets into quite a few, and some of them might surprise you. For starters, he really emphasizes acquiring political knowledge.
Huh. Why was that so important to him? I mean, back then, people didn't have access to information like we do today.
Right. But his point was that informed citizens make better choices when they vote.
So they can see through the BS.
Exactly. They can critically evaluate candidates, understand the impact of policies.
So it's not just about voting, but voting responsibly.
Exactly. He was adamant that civic duty went beyond blindly supporting a friend or just voting along party lines.
It was about making informed decisions for the good of the whole community.
The whole community, not just your own little corner of it.
Okay, that makes sense. What other duties did he highlight?
Another one he really emphasized was the responsibility to advocate for good laws, laws grounded in justice.
I imagine that felt especially urgent, given that he was writing just a few years after the Civil War.
Absolutely. A time of immense social and political change. He saw firsthand how important it was to create laws that upheld the rights of all citizens.
Not just a select few.
Right. And it makes you think about how we participate in shaping a more just society, even today.
Definitely. Okay, so we've got voting responsibly, advocating for good laws, anything else?
Well, there's a lot more. But before we get into those, I'm curious. Do you think this book was just all sunshine and roses about the state of the Republic?
That's a good question. What do you think?
I think he was definitely idealistic, but he also wasn't naive. He issued some pretty stark warnings, too,
Warnings. About what?
about potential dangers that could undermine a free society. And some of them are surprisingly relevant to what we're seeing today.
Oh, and that's interesting. I love it when we can connect these older texts to current events. It's like they have something to teach us even centuries later.
Yeah, for sure. So what do you say we dive into those warnings and see how they hold up in the 21st century?
Let's do it. All right, so what kind of dangers did he flag? What was he worried about?
Well, one that really stood out to me was his concern about the influence of what he called foreign sentiments on American values.
Foreign sentiments. That's a loaded phrase, isn't it?
It is, and we definitely need to view it in its historical context. Remember, he was writing just a few years after the Civil War.
Right, a time when defining what it meant to be American was a major focus.
Exactly. There was a lot of anxiety about national unity.
And he was worried about outside forces undermining that unity.
It makes you wonder, though, how he would react to today's world.
With globalization, the internet.
Right. Information and ideas are constantly flowing across borders.
Would he see that as a threat to national identity or an opportunity for progress?
Tough to say. It's definitely a question worth pondering, but let's get back to those dangers.
Yeah.
What else was he concerned about?
Yeah, what else was on his list?
He was really worried about excessive desire for wealth and power.
Like greed.
Yeah, basically. He argued that it could actually replace civic virtue,
Meaning people would become so focused on getting ahead?
that they'd forget about their responsibilities to the community.
Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Right. That tension between individual ambition and the common good.
It's classic struggle.
He was afraid that if people focused more on what they could take rather than what they could contribute.
The Republic would suffer.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got foreign sentiments, we've got greed. Anything else keeping this guy up at night?
Oh, yeah, there's more. He also pointed to corruption in government as a major threat.
Corruption, isn't that like a problem in every society?
Sure, to some extent. But he used this really vivid image to describe it. He said it could spread like a disease.
Whoa. Okay, that's not a good image. But I get it. How did he see this corruption taking root?
He argued that it often starts small with minor favors or, those backroom deals.
But that becomes normalized.
People start to think it's just how things are done.
Exactly. And once those in power begin to prioritize personal gain over the common good,
The whole system starts to decay.
trust erodes, cynicism takes root.
It's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
And it really does make you think about the importance of transparency and accountability in government.
For sure. And about the role citizens play in holding their leaders to high ethical standards.
So it's not enough to just hope for honest leaders. We have to demand it.
We have to hold them accountable.
Exactly. Oh, and along with corruption, he also saw political apathy as a huge danger.
Apathy. You mean like people just not caring?
Yeah, not participating, not staying informed, not voting.
Tuning out.
Right. He said that was a luxury a republic could not afford.
I can see why. I mean, it's easy to get overwhelmed and discouraged.
Especially when things feel chaotic.
Or you feel like your vote doesn't really matter.
Right. But he argued that when citizens don't participate,
They create a void.
and that void can be filled by people with,
Less noble intentions.
Exactly.
It's a powerful reminder that the health of a republic depends on us.
On each and every citizen.
We can't just sit back and expect things to magically get better.
We have to participate. We have to stay engaged.
He saw civic engagement as both a right and a responsibility.
Essential for protecting the freedoms that a republic provides.
So are we living up to that responsibility today?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think it's one each listener will have to grapple with for themselves.
It's definitely a lot to think about.
Yeah.
It really is. Okay, so we've talked about the dangers he saw on the horizon. But I'm also curious, if he could take a time machine to 2023, what do you think he'd be most impressed by?
Ooh, good question. I mean, I think he'd be amazed by how far we've come in terms of equality and justice.
Yeah.
Think about it. He was writing just a few years after the Civil War.
Right, at a time of huge social change.
Exactly. To see the progress we've made with civil rights, inclusivity,
I bet that would give him hope.
definitely. And on a totally different note, I think he'd be blown away by our technology.
Oh, yeah. Can you imagine trying to explain the internet to someone from the 1870s?
Right, smartphones, social media, his mind would be blown. But, speaking of social media,
Hmm.
that actually leads me to what I think might concern him most about modern America.
Oh, what's that?
I think he'd see the rise of these online platforms, the spread of misinformation, as a fulfillment of his warning about foreign sentiments.
Ah, interesting point. Like, the battleground has shifted from physical borders to the digital world.
Exactly. Instead of foreign armies, we're dealing with foreign bots and algorithms trying to influence our opinions.
It's like a new kind of information warfare.
Right. And then, on top of that, I think he'd be really troubled by the growing economic inequality we see today.
The gap between the rich and the poor.
Yeah, it's only gotten wider since his time. I think he'd see that as a sign that we're moving away from that idea of shared responsibility he talked about.
Like, we're becoming too individualistic.
Maybe. And I think he would urge us to rediscover those core principles he laid out, not as outdated rules, but as a guiding light for how we can create a better society.
So how do we do that? What does this all mean for us here in the 21st century?
Well, it's a reminder that the ideals of a republic, freedom, self-government,
Hmm.
they don't just run on autopilot.
They need our attention.
Exactly. They need our active participation, our critical thinking, our willingness to do the hard work of, building a better future.
It's not about blindly following the rules from a 150-year-old book.
Right. It's about understanding those underlying principles.
Yeah.
And then figuring out how to apply them to our own time.
So it's a challenge, but it's
an
also,
opportunity
yeah, I like that, an opportunity.
to shape the future we want to see.
And it all starts with each of us
Each individual citizen.
choosing to engage, to participate,
Ah,
to make a difference.
exactly.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into a guide to moral and social manners. A big thanks to you for joining me on this journey back to 1872. It's been fascinating.
It has, and it's definitely given us all a lot to think about.
So as you go about your day today, think about what civic virtue means to you. How are you contributing to your community, to the future of our republic? Are we, as a nation, living up to those ideals we talked about?
And even more importantly, what kind of society do you want to live in? What role are you going to play in making that happen?
Those are great questions to ponder. And until next time, keep those inward senses sharp, everyone.
And remember, the fate of a republic rests in the hands of its citizens.